Welcome to another A-level biology video. This is Mr Phillips, starting off with the first lesson to do with photosynthesis. So even though it says it in a different way on the specification, I would always suggest do respiration first and then go on to photosynthesis, and this will make photosynthesis a lot more easy to cope with. So, introduction to photosynthesis. So to start off then, we need to just understand that obviously these two reactions are very, very linked. Now we should know, if you've done the respiration module already, that this is a very simplified equation, but effectively animals, for example, that do, and obviously plants do respiration as well, but animals are heterotrophs, okay? So we ingest and digest and then absorb our glucose, okay? And we also obviously breathe in oxygen. Well, they then are the products of photosynthesis. So those products of photosynthesis become the reactants of respiration. So obviously these two reactions are very, very linked. And again, the opposite way around, I suppose, which I should really mention, is the products of respiration, which is water and carbon dioxide, and obviously the energy we make, they become the reactants of photosynthesis. So really well balanced equation, but it shows you the importance of the two interacting. And where it becomes important in plants is something called the compensation point. So plants also respire. So plants will be using up oxygen, using glucose, and releasing carbon dioxide and obviously water, but it's the carbon dioxide we're interested in. There's something called the compensation point. So if we have a look at this graph, and we start off here at sort of 0 hours to midnight. Okay, obviously the sun isn't up at that time of night. So what happens here is the green line, this one, which I'm just, I'll go over in green actually, there we go. This one is the rate, so increasing there, this is the rate of respiration. Obviously that generally goes up a bit during the day, drops down a bit at night. Okay, don't need to really worry about why, but other reactions in the plants will need that, so we'll need the ATP, so that's why effectively. And then you've got the red line, which shows you the rate of photosynthesis. So obviously before sort of 10 o'clock in the morning, so before this sort of time here, you can see the red line is below the green line. So if I draw that there, and that is what we call the compensation point. So the compensation point is the point where the rate of respiration and the rate of photosynthesis are the same. So there's no net gain or loss of oxygen, and there's no net gain or loss of carbohydrate being made. And again, for us, carbon dioxide is not being released or absorbed any more than normal. And then obviously during the rest of the day, when the sun's high in the sky and we're doing lots of photosynthesis, the rate of photosynthesis increases until it starts to drop again late afternoon. And then there's a second compensation point where the rate of photosynthesis is lower than the rate of respiration. So at that point, the plant would start releasing carbon dioxide. Again, another way of showing it here, so this is based around carbon dioxide. You can see there's this compensation point here at this 0 on the graph. Okay, so that is when there is 0 carbon dioxide given out and 0 carbon dioxide absorbed. And as the light intensity increases during the day, the rate of photosynthesis increases, and eventually the amount of carbon dioxide absorbed is greater than the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted. And that is because the rate of photosynthesis is greater than the rate of respiration. So here we've got two different compensation points, okay? So the compensation point for blue plants, which is the shaded plant, is this line here, and it shows you they have a lower compensation point. So plants that live in the shade, which won't get that high level of sunlight, have to be able to do photosynthesis under lower light intensities. So they'll hit the compensation point under lower levels of shade, so they won't do as much oxygen production during the day, as you can see from this graph, but they'll do it for longer. So they won't hit the same peaks, I should have said, but they'll do it for longer. Plants that live in the sun have a higher level of oxygen production, but they will do it for a shorter amount of time during the day. So then we need to learn the structure of chloroplasts. Okay, so you should know this from AS level of biology, but you might not have looked at it in much detail because your teacher might have told you, or I might have told you, it's more important in year 13, of which it is. So effectively, this is the structure of a chloroplast. So it looks like a cell, and there is a reason for that, which we'll talk about later on. So the structure that we're going to know is it has two layers to its membrane. So it's a double-bounded double membrane bounded organelle. So you've got the external layer of the membrane, the internal layer of the membrane. You've then got like the fluid structure, which obviously goes all the way around the cell, so all of this stuff here. And that is, like we would have called it in the mitochondria, the mitochondrial matrix is where a lot of different enzymes are, and that is particularly useful for photosynthesis, and that is called the stroma of the cell. I couldn't find the word there. Stroma of the cell. The stroma of the cell is where we have what we call the dark stage or the dark reaction of photosynthesis, also more effectively known as the light independent stage. Okay, so that is where that happens. Then we have these stacks of molecules or membranes here called thylakoids. Now, one thylakoid is one stack. So if you imagine it as like stacks of 2p coins, each 2p coin is a thylakoid. So there's one thylakoid with another one on top of it and another one on top of it. When you stack them all together, though, we call a stack of thylakoids the granum. Okay, and the membrane of the granum is called a lamella, which you can't see is actually labelled on here, but you do need to know. So all this membrane here is called the lamella, and between grana stacks, it's called intergrana lamella, and that will become more important as we go forward. There is actually DNA inside chloroplasts. So we said in year 12 that most of the DNA is found in the nucleus of the cell, but mitochondria and the chloroplasts do have their own DNA. There'd be lots of lipids in the chloroplast to help with membrane formation, and that's obviously, and also formation of vesicles, lots of starch grains as well. So let's have a look and actually look at how is the light absorbed. And obviously that is the main job of the chloroplast. So keep going for that. So you might be asked to talk about them, or what you might be given a micrograph, electron micrograph of a chloroplast, and you might have to label it. So I think we'll use this one on the right because these days exam images are always quite good. So you can see here, if I use a yellow, I think, that these are your thylakoids. So you've got like there's a thylakoid there. Obviously, I'm just sort of estimating. There's a thylakoid there. There's a thylakoid there. So this whole structure here, as long as this one here and this one here and lots of them, they are granum, stacks of thylakoids. Okay, you've then got quite a few starch grains that you can, lipid molecules that you can see hanging around. Okay, and you've got the strings between the granum and your intergrana lamellae. Obviously, this clear area or grey area is the stroma. Okay, so lots of areas you should be able to recognise on the internal structure of a chloroplast. So just really briefly, so DNA, you can pause this if you want to look at this a bit more, but DNA is like mitochondria DNA, they do have themselves. It's only required to make a small amount of proteins in the cell, but there's only a small amount of DNA. Inner and outer membranes are made of phospholipid membranes that are involved with allowing proteins in and out. Intermembrane space is fluid-filled space between two membranes, and that's all you really need to know. Chloroplasts have ribosomes, proteins. The stroma is obviously a very important structure. It's where the light-independent reaction happens. It's got lots of chemicals inside it, which we'll talk about later on, and the reaction is known as the Kevin cycle that happens in there. We've then got the starch grains, which is obviously the energy store that's made when glucose is made in photosynthesis. It's converted to starch to be stored away, and then the granum are a stack of membranes, also known as thylakoids, which is where the light-dependent stage happens in photosynthesis, and that's in the lamella, which is the membrane of a thylakoid. So that's that really. So then we need to look at the actual pigments. So what is actually absorbing the sunlight? So for years you've said chlorophyll is the pigment that absorbs the sunlight, which acts as energy in photosynthesis. And that is true. There's no lie to that. But we need to know a little bit more. So first of all, the chlorophyll is found embedded in the membrane in something called a photosystem, which we'll talk about very shortly. This is the structure of chlorophyll. So if you're asked for the structure of it, you'd be expected to say that chlorophyll is made of something called a porphyrin ring with a phosphate group, an inorganic group of magnesium. So that's the importance of magnesium in plants, which is why they have to absorb it from the soil. So it's a porphyrin ring with a hydrocarbon tail. You wouldn't be expected to draw it out, but you would be expected to be able to sort of describe porphyrin ring with a hydrocarbon tail, and in the porphyrin ring, the centering atom central atom is a magnesium atom. So the pigments, then, what we're talking about pigments is these are what we call the pigments are proteins that absorb different wavelengths of light, and that maximizes the rate of photosynthesis. A lot of people get confused with this, but we do need to spend some time ensuring we understand it. There are two main groups in higher plants, which mean flowers and trees, and they are chlorophyll pigments, which generally absorb the light of red, green, red and blue violet regions, and they reflect green. Hence, chlorophyll leaves look green to us. And there are two types of chlorophyll there, A and B. But basically, they absorb a very slightly different wavelength of light to the maximum level. Now, how these are arranged is really important. The pigments are arranged in light harvesting clusters known as photosystems. And often you get questions about these photosystems and people can't quite answer them because they've not learned this bit as they're doing the rest of photosynthesis. So the reason that photosystems are important is they're absorbing the sunlight and directing the energy to trigger photosynthesis. So photosystems are arranged into light harvesting clusters known as pigments are arranged into light harvesting clusters known as photosystems. Basically, a photosystem contains all the pigments working together. There might be several hundred something called accessory pigments and one primary pigment. And we'll talk about that in a second because an accessory pigment can be carotenoids, chlorophyll B, or even different forms of chlorophyll A. Let's have a look at these two pictures in a bit more detail. So what we have in the center of the reaction center is a primary pigment. And this is where something called hydrolysis of water is going to happen, or photolysis of water is going to happen, sorry. This is where the energy is going to be directed to break up the water molecule in start off photosynthesis. All the other molecules here, which are represented by orange and green, so different types of chloroplasts and carotenoids, all of these are accessory pigments. So what they will do is they'll absorb different wavelengths of light depending on what colour they actually are and what properties they actually are, and then they funnel the light effectively down towards this central, the energy from the light, sorry, down towards this primary pigment, which then starts photosynthesis. So at the top here, we've got sort of another version of it, okay, which says light energy absorbed by the chlorophyll molecule. The energy is passed from one to another, and then it emits a high energy electron. And that's the point of this primary pigment at the bottom here, is it's going to emit an electron, which starts off the photosynthesis reaction effectively. Okay, so then let's have a look at these other things. So a lot of the accessory pigments are called carotenoids, which are found highly in carrots and oranges. So they absorb a lot of the blue, a lot of the green light spectrum, but they don't absorb any orange, hence it's reflected. And they are very different in terms of their structure. But the point of them is they pass the energy to that primary pigment, which is normally chlorophyll A in the reaction center. And basically, the different wavelengths of light here get absorbed by different pigments. So you can see here, if I go along the blue pigments, we've got chlorophyll A here. This is absorbing high levels of purple pigment, drops down to the blue to green, and it starts to build up again for red wavelengths of light there. So the different pigments absorb different wavelengths of light, and they all send it to this primary pigment center, which then excites an electron, and that triggers off your photosynthesis. Now, just to mention, last of all, why does the chloroplast have DNA? Well, the theory is that something called the endosymbiont theory. And the endosymbiont theory is the idea that that mitochondria in animal and plant cells and chloroplasts in just plant cells were once probably independent prokaryotic cells. And what would have happened is they would have become into a mutualistic relationship or a symbiotic relationship with a larger cell, then that would have formed the first eukaryotic cells. Hence, they still have DNA in them today. And that is quite important because obviously that shows us the evolution of cells over time. So I hope that's been useful for you guys. I'll see you next time.